On March 24, 1989, the Exxon Valdez oil tanker spilled 11 million gallons of crude oil into the pristine waters of Prince William Sound in Alaska. It was a monumental environmental disaster, and while some of the wildlife recovered, others have not, and the effects can still be seen 30 years later. Not only was this a mistake that changed the world, but it's one that we should not forget, because as the Arctic ice is melting, there are plans for more shipping traffic in the north. Also, there are more pipelines being built to transport oil and natural gas in pristine wilderness areas. We need to make sure that we learn from the past and make sure regulations are not relaxed as companies focus on making profit. What is striking about this disaster is that it was a perfect storm of human errors, and so this means that there were a number of ways it could have been prevented. Back in 1971, when Congress approved the Prince William Sound water route for oil tanker traffic, Exxon and other giant oil corporations made a number of promises to the people. They promised the use of state-of-the-art radar technology, the placement of oil spill equipment throughout Prince William Sound, and they also promised that they would keep full-time emergency response crews at the ready. Sadly, in the Exxon Valdez disaster, none of these promises were kept. The captain of the Exxon Valdez was Joseph Hazelwood, and it is clear that he made a number of mistakes which led to the disaster. On March 24, 1989, he changed the ship's course to avoid icebergs in Prince William Sound. Close to midnight, Hazelwood gave control of the ship to a third mate, Gregory Cousins, who tried to steer the ship back to the original course. Unfortunately, the ship's radar was broken, and he did not see Bligh Reef. Just after midnight, the Exxon Valdez crashed into the reef. The Bligh Reef was a well-known navigation hazard, and steering the massive vessel back on course should not have been left to an inexperienced and unlicensed third mate.
Captain Hazelwood then made a decision that would doom the ship. He turned the bridge over to the third mate with instructions to turn back into the shipping lane.
I went down to my office. I had some paperwork to fill out and I wanted to look at the latest weather.
The third mate called Hazelwood and said he was turning, but what happened next remains a mystery. The third mate and the helmsman at the wheel both say they followed orders, but whether it was miscommunication or poor navigation, the Exxon Valdez did not turn back into the shipping lane when it was supposed to.
The turn was initiated, it was just initiated late.
So late that the ship ran aground on Bligh Reef.
The impact of the collision tore open the ship's hull, causing some 11 million gallons of crude oil to spill into the water. Over time, the oil slick covered 1,300 miles of coastline, as you can see on this map in the dark green, killing hundreds of thousands of seabirds, otters, seals, and whales. In the first days of the spill, there was no oil recovery or cleanup equipment in the water. Exxon simply was not ready and lacked cleanup equipment and personnel. In fact, shortly after the Exxon Valdez oil spill gripped the world with images of an environmental disaster, the CEO of the oil company predicted that in a few years there would be nothing to evidence the disaster.
My feeling is, whatever you killed, there's plenty more of it right down here, and it's going to come back. If you don't remove the oil, nature is going to eventually remove it, but it's going to look bad for a long time, and the publicity is going to be horrible. You kill some little critters in the process, you couldn't possibly kill them all. So they're going to repropagate.
Prince William Sound had been a pristine wilderness before the spill. The Exxon Valdez disaster dramatically changed all of that, taking a major toll on the wildlife. It killed an estimated 250,000 seabirds, 3,000 otters, 300 seals, 250 bald eagles, 22 killer whales, and billions of salmon and herring eggs. While some species have recovered, this catastrophic oil spill played a role in the collapse of the fisheries in Prince William Sound in the 1990s. These were very important sources of income for local fishermen. People went bankrupt, and the economies of small shoreline towns, including Valdez and Cordova, suffered in the following years. In fact, neither the salmon nor the herring fisheries have fully rebounded. In terms of the accident, investigators later learned that Joseph Hazelwood, the captain, had been drinking at the time and had given the helm to third mate Gregory Cousins. It also came out that Hazelwood had been drinking in bars earlier that day. There were charges against him for operating a vessel while intoxicated, reckless engagement, and illegally discharging oil. However, in the end, only the last charge stuck, and he had to do community service and pay a $50,000 fine. It should be noted that while one man made some crucial mistakes, the Exxon Corporation should have been held more responsible as well. The Exxon Valdez had the sophisticated fairway option radar on board, which should have made it all but impossible for a tanker of this size to collide into Bligh Reef. But the radar wasn't turned on. In fact, the crew didn't even know how to use it. At any rate, it was out of order, which Exxon knew about for at least a year. Apparently, it was just too expensive to fix and operate. Another mistake was also made by the Coast Guard, who had lost the Exxon Valdez on their radar, but the staff were not alarmed at all and did not communicate the problem. It was also revealed Exxon ignored reports that Hazelwood had been drinking for 3 years prior to the accident. In fact, Hazelwood's driver's license had been revoked due to drinking and driving. Worst of all, Exxon was entirely ill-prepared for any kind of oil spills, as shown by their delayed reaction to the collision. In 1984, there had been an internal memo written by James Woodall of Alaska, the Alaska Pipeline Operations, indicating that he had serious doubts that they would be able to effectively contain even a medium-sized oil spill. Woodall cited outdated, inadequate, and broken equipment. His internal memo didn't even see the light of day until after the 1989 spill. Long before the disaster, little spills could have warned of a system breakdown. Erlene Blake, a senior lab technician, told investigators that Alaska routinely ordered her to change test results to reduce oil in water readings, eliminating evidence of small spills. When the transport route was being negotiated in 1971, native fishermen who knew the sound and lived off of what they caught demanded the right to man the full-time spill response teams so that they can protect their land and waterways. The oil companies, as part of the $1 deal for Valdez, hired the native crews who were trained, equipped, and ready to drop from helicopters to contain oil spills at a moment's notice. But the oil companies quietly dismissed them by 1979. The oil companies deflected government inspectors by creating sham spill response teams of untrained pipeline workers who didn't have the foggiest idea on what to do in the case of a spill.
Alaska is facing an ecological disaster. Thousands of seabirds are dying in the slick, which also threatens rare sea otters, seals, whales, and salmon.
Neither Exxon nor Alyeska, the oil pipeline company in charge of the immediate response, was ready for such a large spill.
Alyeska was supposed to have an emergency response team at its terminal in Valdez, but 8 years ago the team was disbanded.
The response vessels were either under snow or being repaired. They were completely overwhelmed. Coast Guard didn't quite know what to do.
Equipment to fight this spill has to be flown in from as far away as Texas and England.
Exxon says it's using all available resources, but it argues the spill is simply too big to surround with booms and skim it up.
As images of the spill appeared on the evening news,
Growing questions about how future disasters of this kind can be prevented and why there was such a slow response to this spill.
Another little-known fact: 10 months prior to the spill, oil companies from Alaska, including Exxon, met to discuss the challenges that would occur if a tanker spilled oil in the middle of the Sound. At the meeting, the companies discussed the impossibilities of a cleanup in the area and indicated that to have an effective cleanup, they would need to spend millions of dollars on equipment each year. So they voted against dedicating additional funds for such cleanup efforts. A 2001 study found contamination remaining at more than half of the 91 beach sites tested in Prince William Sound. It's impossible to fully clean up, so some of the oil is still there, buried in 4 to 8 inches of sand and some covered by stones. A powerful storm or earthquake could resurface the oil into the Sound, but digging it up could do more harm than good. While on the surface there appears to have been a great deal of recovery, the oil is likely to remain for decades to come.
In September 1991, 3 summers after the spill, Exxon declared the beaches safe. 25% of the oil had evaporated, and of the rest, the company felt it had removed what it could. But doubts still remain about the scale of the cleanup.
There still exists long-term environmental damage in Prince William Sound. After 3 summers of $2 billion worth of work, 13,000 workers, 1,000 vessels, 100 aircraft, they recovered maybe 5% of what was spilled. So, pretty ineffective.
pockets of oil remain beneath the surface of some beaches more than 2 decades later.
Prince William Sound is not the same as it was. The environment still has not fully recovered, and we're over 2 decades into this now.
Exxon paid $300 million to those hurt by the spill, and a jury later awarded another $5 billion in punitive damages. Exxon appealed, delaying the case for 14 years and leaving lasting bitterness in Alaska.
4,000 of the original plaintiffs have died since the Exxon Valdez.
In 2008, the Supreme Court cut punitive damages to 1/10 of the original amount.
The community is still very depressed.
Fishermen like Mike Weber say the local economy never recovered.
One real positive that came out of this environmental disaster was the U.S. Oil Pollution Act of 1990, which now includes penalties for oil companies and increased safety regulations, such as the requirement to have double-hull tankers in U.S. waters. Worldwide, large spills from tankers have gone down significantly, even as the production of oil has increased, in no small part due to the new regulations. Surprisingly, though, the Exxon Valdez was only the 11th worst oil spill at 11 million gallons. The largest was actually not an accident. It was the result of the 1991 Gulf War, when Iraqi forces opened pipelines and set fires as they withdrew. It led to 240 million gallons of oil being discharged into the Persian Gulf. The second biggest oil spill into the ocean was from the BP Deepwater Horizon oil drilling platform in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. At 35,000 feet, it was the deepest well ever drilled until the blowout that killed 11 workers. Over nearly 90 days, the broken well pumped 140 million gallons of oil into the Gulf. Some suggested it may have been much higher, possibly 206 million gallons. It's important that we not forget these kinds of disasters. In fact, more and more oil drilling is being done offshore in deep waters off the US and around the world. Recently, the Trump administration proposed opening up far more offshore areas to drilling. As we can see with Exxon Valdez, corporations will make elaborate promises to get approvals, but they often fail to keep those promises. A 1997 Pew Center study found the Exxon Valdez oil spill to rank among the top 20 news stories of its decade. For an entire generation, the images of seabirds covered in black slicks and rescue workers power washing boulders became iconic images for the dangers of oil production at large. It's clear that the corporation was responsible for the accident by failing to keep their original safety promises and by neglecting to properly manage and train their personnel. I think the lesson here is that companies cannot be trusted to monitor their own safety standards because they will always be tempted by the bottom line to cut costs. The mistakes leading to the collision were avoidable, and if the corporation had kept their original promises on safety and cleanup, the long-term environmental damage could have been mitigated. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give us a like and subscribe. Thank you.